Buckingham Palace, the official London residence of kings and queens since Queen Victoria made it so in the mid-19th century. London's most famous building is the trademark of the British monarchy and home of the royal family firm, an endearing term coined by King George VI, who as Bertie Duke of York married his young bride Elizabeth in 1923. From the balcony of Buckingham Palace, he presented his new wife to the cheering crowds. Earlier, in a letter to his mother, Queen Mary, he wrote, "The more I see her, the more I love her." Nearly 60 years later, that young bride, now Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, acknowledges the cheers from the same balcony where she had once stood with her young husband. She had a glorious life. Outside her London home, Clarence House, the Queen Mother received greetings from well-wishers and a parade of the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery, who had turned out to celebrate her birthday. On that occasion, she was surrounded by 4 generations of monarchy, her family, including her grandson, Prince Charles, and her great-grandson, Prince William. A moment perhaps when she paused to remember her own early years as a young girl in Scotland. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on the 4th of August 1900 and spent an idyllic childhood within a large and loving family. She had 8 elder brothers and sisters. Her father, the 14th Earl of Strathmore, was descended from King Robert II of Scotland, who inherited a small fortune in 1904, making him a multi-millionaire by today's standards.
They were an extremely grand family, so she was brought up in a very Edwardian way with plenty of servants, with plenty of money. They were in fact very rich indeed, and this in a way has never left her. She's always learned then to live very well, and so throughout her life she has always lived very extravagantly. I think the fact she's brought up in this very privileged, very luxurious way has remained with her all her life.
Elizabeth grew up at Glamis Castle, set in a park remodelled in the fashion of landscape gardener Capability Brown. Its rooms were hung with portraits of all the 14th Earl's children. Glamis Castle is one of Scotland's most impressive ancient buildings and was in the Strathmore family from 1372.
They were, in a way, an odd family. The father, Lord Strathmore, was something of an old eccentric. The mother had all the charm and the drive that I think the Queen Mother has inherited from her. But they were very close indeed. There were lots of them. The ages ranged over about 20, 25 years.
The young Elizabeth was closest to her brother David. They were fun-loving, and together they enjoyed dressing up for dancing lessons at Glamis Castle.
They were like a sort of extra little family at the end of the line, and she was very, very close with him. She was very, very fond of him. And both of them were charming children in a very natural way. I think their mother used to call them the 2 little Benjamins. And my father actually was with David Bowes-Lyon, her brother, in the Special Operations Executive during the Second World War. And he told me that David was one of the most unpretentious people you could possibly imagine. No side, no aristocratic hauteur or anything like that. He's just a lovely, lovely man. And I think she was much the same.
The First World War broke out in August 1914 on Elizabeth's 14th birthday. It was a traumatic time for the young girl. Her brother Michael was reported killed, wrongly as it turned out. King George V was photographed visiting the trenches in France, but the news from the front was gloomy. Back in Scotland at Glamis Castle, the Strathmore family opened their home to wounded officers, and the young Elizabeth was always there to make them feel comfortable.
During the war, Glamis was turned into a convalescent home for officers. So the Queen Mother, she then was Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, did a little work at the hospital there, and I think it really made a deep impression on her. She was very impressionable at that time. She would have been 14 years old when the First World War started, 18 when it finished. So in fact, in these very impressionable years, it certainly left its mark on her, and I think throughout her life.
At her home at Glamis Castle, the young Elizabeth received letters from wounded officers. Always caring and considerate, she took time to reply. Dear Harding, thank you so much for your letter. I'm sorry that you can't find a job. It seems to be very difficult now.
She saw, if not the actual business of war, she saw the results of it. And she was a sort of part nurse, part companion, part younger sister. She used to read to them, she used to write letters for them, and she was just with these wounded soldiers. And one of them said at the time that something that's been noticed about her often since then, that when she spoke to you, it was as if you were the only person in the world.
Elizabeth was described as a shy little person under her ebullient exterior by her mother, who wanted her to marry an heir to a British dukedom. Instead, Elizabeth took a fancy to the handsome James Stuart, son of the Earl of Moray, who had returned from the war with the Military Cross.
As a young Deb, there were plenty of men. Of course, she was a great beauty. One forgets now how lovely she was when she was very young. But I think one of the men she felt very much in love with was James Stuart. Now, he was an equerry to the Duke of York, who was afterwards her husband. And she was very much in love with him. He was very much in love with her. But I think that her parents, particularly her mother, didn't really want to encourage this match, nor did Queen Mary, who was hoping that she would marry her second son, Bertie. So the two mothers got together and they sent poor James Stuart away to Canada. So he got out of the way so she could then was free to marry the Duke of York.
Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon met Prince Albert, Bertie to his family, at a Mayfair ball in 1920, shortly after he was made the Duke of York. 3 months later, Bertie visited Glamis Castle.
After the war, she went and did the season, which young girls of her birth did at that time and were still doing now, really. She met him as part of the sort of general getting together of high-born young men and women in what was really a marriage market, but disguised beautifully as socialising. And she met him that way. They all met in that way. They were sort of put together, not like two dogs in a room, but in human terms, socialising was really for the purpose of marriage.
Bertie's parents were King George V and Queen Mary. His father believed that fear should govern his children, all of whom were terrified of him. Bertie on the left was their second son. His eldest brother David on the right was always singled out for particularly unpleasant treatment.
Queen Mary believed, she believed that it was more important that her husband was the king of her children rather than their father. He was rather bad-tempered and grouchy old codger at the time. And he once said that I was terrified of my father, that is the very genial, apparently, Edward VII, and I'm going to make bloody sure that my children are afraid of me. Now, I don't know if this is actually what he did, but he was a bad-tempered old grouch, and they were frightened of him, and all of them were highly nervous. Many of them suffered from digestive troubles, which is a sign of extreme nervousness.
This unhappy childhood took its toll on the young Bertie, later the Duke of York, who was terrified of his father.
King George V and Queen Mary were really very bad parents. They were very remote, they were very cold, they really couldn't relate to their children very well. So the sons and the daughter were brought up really by tutors, by nannies. They didn't have a good relationship with the parents at all. This had a long-term effect on the man who became the Duke of York and who then became King George VI, in that he was born with a stammer, or he developed a stammer as a young man. And the fact that he had this very bad relationship with his father, he was very frightened of his father, this didn't help the stammer in any way at all. He was a very shy man, a very diffident man, a very awkward man, a very gauche man.
For a time, Bertie's brother David, heir to the throne, was interested in Elizabeth, but he never fell in love with her, despite her attraction to him. Reflecting his loveless childhood, David was a rebellious, weak man who preferred more sophisticated women. In 1920, while his brother courted Elizabeth, David, now the Prince of Wales, fell for Mrs. Freda Dudley Ward, a married woman with 2 children.
He was, after all, the Prince of Wales, and he was off on his own demi-monde, which was not the royal sort of social circle. I don't think that she ever seriously considered him, because at one time when the press got them together, as the press does, they both made a hell of a fuss about it, denying it like mad.
In January 1923, Elizabeth and Bertie became engaged. Marriage to his brother was not on. In any case, she preferred Bertie.
She was a perfect wife for him. Now, she wasn't really very anxious to marry him because, for one thing, she didn't really want to give up her freedom to lead this rather cloistered, rather confined royal life. And for other things, she wasn't really in love with him. He was an attractive man. He was, in a way, a very diffident kind of man. So I think she was drawn to him because she had a great deal of the strengths where he had the weaknesses. But I don't think it was a love match. I think they became, in the end, a very good partnership, a very good relationship, but it really wasn't, on her part, a great love match. On his part, certainly, I think he was very much in love with her.
At 23, Elizabeth was a beautiful young woman described by one unsuccessful suitor as having an indescribable and indefinable atmosphere. On her wedding day, the bride stepped out of the family home in Bruton Street, accompanied by her father. 1 million people lined the streets to cheer the royal couple and celebrate the first royal wedding for 500 years. On that cold, damp Thursday in April 1923, eager eyes from the crowd caught sight of what was described as the simplest wedding dress ever made for a royal wedding. The presents came pouring in. Her future father-in-law, King George V, gave her a suite of diamonds, and Queen Mary a sapphire and diamonds from her own collection.
Wedding dresses were very fashionable then. I mean, they reflected absolutely the period of fashion of 1923. It was made of an extraordinary fabric, which I must say puzzles me enormously, which is chiffon moire, which is almost a contradiction in terms. And it was not a regal wedding dress. It was not a royal bride's wedding dress, but it was a sort of a fashionable, aristocratic, young... I mean, it was perfect for exactly who she was. It was the right dress. But, I mean, looking back, it was a very curious shape. But all dresses at that time were curious shapes. I mean, it was a medieval shape with a square neck and these bands of silver lames sort of seeded with pearls going this way, and then a long band going to the floor. So it had this odd medieval look mixed with a 20s sort of straight shape. It's very difficult for us looking back now, though I've just featured in my magazine a veil like it, to have these veils which were in fact, instead of just being kind of clouds of misty tulle, which the Queen Mother went into later in her life, they were rather oppressive, almost claustrophobic cloches, sort of ribboned down. And she's kept that element later in her life with her hats, but that in private too.
They took their wedding vows at Westminster Abbey and returned to Buckingham Palace in the state glass coach with its imposing escort of cavalry. The Archbishop of York, preaching the sermon, assured them that the warm and generous heart of the people takes you today into itself. Elizabeth was now Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. As fourth royal lady in the land, she was now entitled to curtsies and all the other royal tributes. The procession swept down Constitution Hill and into the palace. There was something very appealing about the bridal couple. His clean-cut good looks complemented her wistful beauty, and they looked radiant. The bride and bridegroom appeared on the balcony to acknowledge the cheers that swept towards them from the crowds. The wedding breakfast was held in the state dining room for 123 people, with 66 of the closest relatives seated at tables prettily decorated with Elizabeth's favourite pink tulips and white lilacs. The young couple left on their honeymoon from Waterloo Station, destined for the seclusion of a private house in Surrey, and then on to Glamis Castle in Scotland. The press had taken a keen interest in the activities of the new royal bride, and she had agreed to give an interview to a magazine, much to the chagrin of her royal in-laws.
The interview she gave, which she sort of did because she was a nice, outgoing, newly married young woman, was to a magazine, and she was giving away a few of what King George V, her father-in-law, had considered to be royal secrets, like what they had for breakfast and what the colour of the furniture was. And he told her, please don't do that. He adored her, actually, so he wasn't grouchy with her. And I think she took the lesson to heart. And although the royal families have been more sort of forthcoming since then, and we know more about them, or think we do, I think that rule stuck. What her father-in-law told her has lasted for a lifetime.
On the 21st of April 1926, after a difficult labour, the Duchess of York gave birth to a girl. Queen Mary wrote in her diary, a little darling with a lovely complexion and pretty fair hair. She was christened Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, giving her the same initials as her mother. In April 1930, her sister Princess Margaret Rose was born, completing the York's family, and giving the shy and insecure Bertie the strong family unit he had always craved. In 1933, the young Princess Elizabeth accompanied her parents to the Braemar Games. The Duke and Duchess adored their daughters, and Bertie was determined that they should look back on their childhood as a golden time. Meanwhile, Bertie's brother David, Prince of Wales, was enjoying himself. When not travelling around the world as the King's envoy, he mingled with London's society set. He enjoyed close relationships with some of the most beautiful women of his day, including Lady Thelma Furness. But by 1933, there was a new love in David's life, Mrs. Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. Already into her second marriage, the couple were brought together after he invited Wallis and her husband to join his party of royal friends for a cruising holiday close to Biarritz.
Wallis and her husband Ernest, her then husband, were social climbers, and you can't get higher than the Prince of Wales. I mean, they weren't going to assail the very top of the tower and get the King and Queen, but the Prince of Wales would do very nicely. I think actually the social climbing aspect was more important to her. If she fell in love with him, which I'm sure she did, at some time, what got her there was the efforts at social climbing, which were of course highly successful.
In 1935, the Duke and Duchess of York, with their two young daughters, attended King George V's and Queen Mary's Silver Jubilee celebrations. Spectacular scenes and a spontaneous show of affection greeted the King and Queen as they drove through the streets of London. The tremendous display of love during this time overwhelmed King George, who had never realised how much the public respected him and his Queen. Meanwhile, at Royal Lodge, Windsor, the Duke and Duchess of York had created a haven of peace and tranquility for their family. They furnished the beautiful pink-walled lodge in the informal style of a typical English country house with views over the garden, which Elizabeth and Bertie had created together. In the gardens of the Royal Lodge, Bertie derived particular pleasure from the huge grounds which developed his interest as a keen amateur gardener.
Both were great gardeners. Of course, again, this is something of the King, being a rather shy man. With a lot of shy people, gardening is a kind of outlet. He was a very, very keen gardener. She was a very keen gardener. And she was never, he was a great shot, like all those royals in those days, used to go hunting and shooting and so on. She herself, she used to shoot a bit in early days, not much.
The old king was by now a very sick man, and Elizabeth and her daughters were photographed with him and Queen Mary shortly before his death. He died on the 20th of January 1936. He had been suffering from bronchial problems for many years. Following his coffin were his sons, led by David, now King Edward VIII, having succeeded his father to the throne. From his deathbed, the old king had prophesied that my son will ruin himself within 12 months. His warning had a certain knowing tone. In fact, it only took 11 months. On a trip abroad, the King and Mrs. Simpson were received by Adolf Hitler. The British public were kept in the dark about his activities with a married woman.
Wallis was kept very much under wraps at first. I mean, the family were aware of her, but she was sort of persona non grata, and David had to go through all sorts of devices to get her even through the gates of Buckingham Palace. And I don't think Elizabeth knew her until she suddenly reared her head as the great obstacle to Edward's remaining king. That, of course, meant that her husband was going to become king in his stead. And at that point, I don't think she thought very fondly of Wallis. They were very different people. I mean, Wallis was hard, shiny, bright, typically brash American, cool, cold. And Elizabeth was aristocratic, but relaxed in the nice English aristocratic way. I don't think they would have got on together at all anyway.
Well, the Duchess of York hated Wallis Simpson because they saw her, she and the rest of the royal family saw her as a kind of brazen, adventurous. The fact that she was American didn't matter because he could have, the future King Edward VIII could have married anyone he liked. I mean, if she was American and unattached, he could have married her, that would have been fine. But she was a woman with two husbands living, divorced from two husbands, and they saw her as a kind of go-getter. They thought she's simply after him. They were sure she wanted to be queen. And so they very much resented her. They saw her as kind of shop-soiled in a way, and that she wasn't really in any way good enough. She didn't have this kind of grand didn't matter, but she didn't have this kind of unsullied background that was necessary for a future Queen of England. So they didn't enjoy her at all. They found her very, very pushy. There's a story that once, when by then he was King Edward VIII, and he was at Balmoral, and by then Wallis Simpson was acting as his hostess. She simply acted as though she was already, you know, his queen. And the Duke and Duchess of York came to dinner one evening. And as they arrived at the front door of Balmoral, so Wallis Simpson came forward to greet the Duke and Duchess of York. And the Queen Mother, as she then became, simply walked straight past her and said, "I've come to dine with the King," making quite clear she wasn't going to be welcomed by this upstart woman at all. She just walked straight past her and went across to there, who was then King Edward VIII. This was their attitude towards her.
David, the king who was never crowned, said goodbye to his family and slipped quietly away from his former kingdom to join Mrs. Simpson. A few months later, in June 1937, they were married in France. None of David's family attended the ceremony. Bertie became King George VI, and Elizabeth became his queen consort. He said, "With my wife and helpmate by my side, I take up the heavy burden which lies before me."
He was highly nervous. He had an ulcer. He had a stammer. I mean, the fellow should have been in a monastery. It would have done him far better. No, he wasn't prepared. He was absolutely terrified. I mean, he burst into tears when he realised what was happening and cried on his mother's shoulder. Now, that monument to duty, probity and self-control couldn't have been very pleased at this. But that's what he did. And I mean, he went around muttering about a lamb to the slaughter. He was totally unprepared, completely untrained. It was completely unexpected.
Coronation Day, 12th of May 1937, was a tremendous ordeal for Bertie. The new king opted for the same date already arranged for his brother's coronation, saying sardonically, "Same date, different king." The pouring rain did nothing to dampen anyone's spirits. In Westminster Abbey, he wore a heavy white satin robe embroidered with shimmering symbols of the empire. He looked ghost white. To many of the guests at this 1,000-year-old sacred ritual, the moment before Bertie was anointed and robed for the crowning was the most touching of all, a symbol perhaps of the loneliness of monarchy. After the coronation, there seemed to be a distinct change in him. He suddenly acquired the regal poise of a king. Beside him, Elizabeth rose to her new responsibilities.
Until she became the Queen, she was always called the Little Duchess, and she was a rather dowdy little woman, always charming, always smiling, always very friendly and so on. But the minute she became Queen, she consciously changed her image. She changed the way she looked. She decided that after Queen Mary, who was so majestic and dignified and remote, she would be a kind of accessible queen, a spontaneous queen, a charming queen, which she naturally was. She changed her whole look. She got into these crinolines in the evening. She dressed herself in this very feminine kind of fashion, in pastel colours and ostrich feathers, in furs, in jewels, and presented herself as this kind of almost pretty as a picture queen. This is how she was going to present herself. And knowing that her husband, knowing that the then King George VI was this diffident, awkward man in public, she thought, well, he will perhaps keep one step away. He will be rather remote, but she will be the one with all the charm. She will go forward. She will step forward in public. And this is how they became, in a way, a kind of complementary couple.
On one of their first official trips abroad, a state visit to France in July 1938, the Republican country fell to the charms of the royal couple. Headlines proclaimed, "We have taken the Queen to our hearts. She rules over 2 nations. France is a monarchy again." French newsreels recorded their visit and were enthralled by her spectacular dresses created by Norman Hartnell.
Every single one of those 30 outfits that Hartnell made for that visit was white. I mean, the parasols was white, the gloves, the shoes, everything was white. And they were all long, which is interesting to know. I mean, even if you did it today, even today, it would be sensational. And the French, it took France by storm. I mean, they're not monarchists by nature, but apparently they said France has lost its heart, it has a new queen. People cheered, people queued. And the fabrics, the sketches of the dresses, they make me want to cry even today. I mean, great garlands of camellias, lace, cobweb lace, tulle, silk organza. I mean, this was... You know, the Queen Mother has something about herself which is unique, and it was uniquely translated by Norman Hartnell for the French visit. I mean, I can remember a friend of my mother's saying that no one will ever repeat that success. Even now, it probably was the greatest fashion statement made by a royal person in the last century.
Norman Hartnell continued to make Queen Elizabeth's clothes until the end of his life. His designs were inspired by the painter Winterhalter.
The Queen Mother was very much to do with couture. She's nothing to do with ready-to-wear at all. And he was the man in the right place at the right time who fully, sympathetically and joyfully accepted to dress this extraordinary woman with this very strong taste of her own, which she's never wavered from, never ever. All the craft, all the kind of skill of couture could be lavished, both money-wise and occasion-wise, on his work for her.
The King and Queen were thrown into a ceaseless round of work. Elizabeth did all she could to lighten her husband's burden and make his official duties and public appearances easier for him. In 1939, with the war clouds looming over Europe, the royal family were filmed by the newsreels attending a scout camp. The United States were next to fall for the royal couple. It was 1939 when the King and Queen embarked on a 6-week royal tour of the continent, the first reigning monarchs to set foot in North America. On the 8th of June 1939, the King and Queen were greeted in Washington by President Roosevelt. Huge crowds turned out to welcome them. The King revelled at this chance to meet the world leader. Queen Elizabeth and the President's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, struck up an instant friendship, as did their husbands. Their visit was a triumph which was to have far-reaching effects for Britain in the darkest days of World War II, a relationship which would prove invaluable. Here, as in France a year before, the American people were captivated by Elizabeth's dignity and grace, and particularly charmed by Norman Hartnell's elegant creations. Their tour included a visit to Canada, much loved by Bertie's father. Despite initial apprehensions, they received a warm welcome, even among the French-speaking population. In performing his public duties, the King was regularly called upon to make speeches, but his speech impediment made this a grueling experience.
It really was very bad. It wasn't exactly a stutter, it was a stammer. He simply couldn't get certain words out. He couldn't pronounce certain letters. So she then encouraged him to go to a speech therapist, a man called Logue, who helped him. She would go with him to every lesson that he had, and she encouraged him.
For a man with a stammer, a speech in French to the people of Quebec was a particularly terrifying experience. Sitting close to him was his wife, giving him all the support she could muster.
He was standing there, and he couldn't see her. She was sitting behind him, at the side of him, but behind him. And he was caught, he stammered over, so he couldn't get a letter out, he couldn't get a word out, and she simply nodded very slowly like that. He couldn't have seen her, but somehow this got through to him, and he took up the word and he said it. So he, in a way, could sense what she was doing, and she was a tremendous help with his stammer, with his public speaking, and with his whole presentation of himself as a monarch. She was a tremendous support.
Politicians acclaimed the accomplished way in which the king moved to centre stage in world affairs. When war was declared on Germany in 1939, he addressed the nation on the wireless and somberly declared, "For the second time in the life of most of us, we are at war." London was pounded by enemy bombs, and the mournful wailing of the air raid sirens seemed endless. At the moment when spirits were at their lowest, the king and queen would appear, suddenly and quite informally, picking their way through the rubble.
Mainly, I think, the way they identified themselves with the public suffering. Whenever there were bombing raids, wherever there was any kind of thing like that, out they would go the following day. They would speak to the people who'd suffered, and they were very, very good identifying themselves with the public. The spirit of the people was absolutely wonderful. They'd say, well, no use grumbling, or Adolf isn't going to get us down. She said we would come back feeling tremendously cheered up by the spirit of the people. And I think this is what gained them this tremendous popularity during the war. They had what is called a good war.
In 1940, Buckingham Palace suffered a direct hit. Elizabeth wrote to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, "My darling mamma, I hardly know how to begin to tell you of the horrible attack on Buckingham Palace this morning. Bertie and I arrived there at 11:15, and he and I went up to our poor windowless rooms. When the royal couple inspected the damage, the Queen said, 'I'm glad we've been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the face.' Adolf Hitler considered her to be the most dangerous woman in Europe."
Hitler had this idea that she was the power behind the throne. Hitler rather falsely thought that the king had far more power than he did have. And he thought, in fact, that the king was a rather foolish man, and that she had all the brains, and that she had all the push, and that she was the woman with this kind of iron will. And therefore he thought she was very dangerous, and that she was the kind of woman who had to be fought down. He didn't really realize, Hitler, how much they were really in the hands of the government. He thought they had a lot of personal power, which they certainly didn't have.
The King and Queen's wartime morale-boosting efforts were unequalled as they travelled at home and abroad to offer encouragement. Newsreels captured a moment when Queen Elizabeth visited the wounded from Dunkirk.
These charming pictures tell their own story of the pleasure that this royal visit brings to the men who have already done a good deal more than their bit. The Queen is glad to learn that the men will also be visited by their relatives. May the presence of their loved ones help to make them well again.
On her many visits to the bomb-damaged sites, Queen Elizabeth, dressed in an elegant and dignified manner, made no apology for always looking smart.
She said, quite honestly, if the poor people were coming to see me, they would certainly look their best, and I shall look my best for them. And I think that's a genuine thing of how she thinks. She likes to look her best. She does to this day. She always has, and she always will.
Hats became her trademark. As a member of the royal family firm, her face had to be visible to the public. She incorporated in their design emblems that reflected the war effort, like the winged insignia of the Royal Air Force.
She liked to say she only got normal rations, but in fact she did get more clothing coupons than most, by a large chalk. But the fact is, she would always wear a hat. I mean, it was unacceptable, I think, for her not to wear a hat. She couldn't have borne to go out. She would not have been dressed. But, I mean, obviously it reflected the sacrifices people were having to make. The hats were much smaller, and they were made of much sturdier, more useful, I mean, cheaper, really, I suppose. Less fancy fabric, felts and wools and tweeds, and a lot of felt, because felt works very well for a hat.
Moments of calm at the height of the war were few and far between. During such times, the King and Queen would retire to Windsor to relax with their daughters. It was often suggested that the royal family should leave the country, but Queen Elizabeth dismissed the idea quickly, saying that they were needed in Britain. Princess Elizabeth was often seen in uniform. Finally, when the King and Queen were utterly exhausted by the rigours of everything they and the country had gone through, the long years of the war drew to a close.
The war made King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, because for one thing they stayed in England. She said to me, they never occurred to us to leave. I think in fact there were plans made to get them away if there'd been a German invasion.
On the 8th of May 1945, victory in Europe was declared and the people celebrated. thousands of people yelled below the balcony at Buckingham Palace. At times during the war, the royal family had unified the people, so close had they become to the nation. Two years after the war ended, a royal marriage between Princess Elizabeth, the 21-year-old future queen, and Philip Mountbatten lifted the post-war gloom on Britain. 3 generations of royalty acknowledged the crowds on the same spot where Princess Elizabeth's parents had stood 24 years before. Scenes of her daughter's wedding must have brought back memories of her own marriage in 1923 to the shy young man, Bertie, Duke of York. A year later, Elizabeth and Bertie celebrated 25 years of their marriage. However, the king's health gave cause for concern. His nervous temperament, his enforced kingship and the rigours of war had taken their toll.
I don't think George VI would have had a long life anyway. He smoked too much, his health was bad, and I don't think being forced into the role of king was all there was to it. I mean, it was obviously a great shock to the system. But I think what really did him in was the Second World War, coming so soon afterwards, only 3 years after he became king. That was a tremendous strain on him. But in his state of health, in his state of nerves, I don't think he'd have lasted long anyway.
King George VI died on the 6th of February 1952, aged 57. On the day of his funeral, the coffin was covered with the royal standard and a wreath bearing the message, "Darling Bertie," from his loving Elizabeth. Following behind the coffin was his eldest brother David, whose abdication in 1936 had forced the crown onto his brother. David followed as a member of the royal family, although his wife Wallis, who had never been accepted as one of them, was not invited. In the eyes of the royal family, she had been the cause of much distress, even perhaps responsible for shortening Bertie's life.
Wallis was nearly, in the view of the royal family itself, nearly brought down the House of Windsor. The Windsors didn't think they were going to survive the abdication, they themselves. I don't think there was any reason for the Queen Mother, who was by then a widow, to forgive Wallis anything at all. I mean, she didn't come out and say that woman was a tart, she ruined my life, I hate her, because that's not the way the Queen Mother works. But I don't think there was any basis for her to forgive Wallis at all, and I don't think she did.
Elizabeth, still young at 51, requested that she be allowed to continue the work that she and her husband had sought to do together. At her daughter's coronation in 1953, Elizabeth, now officially the Queen Mother, became the second queen in British history to watch the crown being placed on the head of her child. She rode in a glass coach with Princess Margaret. Glittering from top to toe in diamonds, she regally played the second lead. While recovering from the loss of her husband, the Queen Mother spotted a derelict castle in Scotland and devoted 12 years to restoring it. She renamed it the Castle of May.
The Queen Mother actually only owns one home, the Castle of May, right perched on the tip of Scotland. And she bought that after the death of George VI. She saw this derelict castle and she said, I'm having it. And it became a symbol of her restoration to life, really, because she was bereft after he died. She wrote to Edith Sitwell, the poet, and said that her heart had shriveled. And she saw this ruined castle and she restored it, and it's her holiday home. And she spends the late summer there and other times.
Every year, for more than 30 years, the Queen, on her way to Balmoral aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, stopped at the Castle of May to say hello to her mother at her holiday home in Scotland. The Queen Mother was a sophisticated lady who also loved country pursuits. Salmon fishing was her lifelong hobby.
She loved fishing. Fishing was one of her great things, and right up till extreme old age, there she would be standing in some Scottish burn with these waders on fishing. She loved fishing. She loved racing, of course. She's very knowledgeable about racing. So she had all these kind of county interests.
Over the years, the Queen Mother and her family were featured more and more in the press and on television. When dealing with photographers and reporters, the Queen Mother's natural charm and elegance shone through. She was the most professional of all the royals as far as the press were concerned, and they admitted that she was quite delightful. The new Queen found her mother's constant advice and good humour was just the support and strength she needed in her new and difficult task. She said, "She has been the most marvellous mother, always standing back and never interfering." In fact, when Princess Margaret fell in love with a divorced man, the Queen Mother allegedly avoided her daughter's problems, fearing a rerun of the abdication crisis. In the event, Group Captain Peter Townsend and Princess Margaret separated, only to be reunited 2 years later. But Margaret, crushed by disapproval of the establishment, decided not to marry him. The Queen Mother was relieved.
When Princess Margaret fell in love with this man who was divorced, she thought, oh my God, here we go again. It's going to be like the abdication all over again. There's the divorced man who's in love with my daughter, and it's going to do tremendous harm for the monarchy, for the throne. But instead, really, of helping Princess Margaret to the extent she should have, she really turned her back on it. She thought, well, I'm just not going to get involved with all this. And in the end, Princess Margaret simply had to give up Townsend, but I think she really could have done more to support her.
5 years later, Princess Margaret was a captivating bride in a dress designed by Norman Hartnell. She married society photographer Anthony Armstrong-Jones, and the newspapers were enthralled with this first major royal celebration since the coronation. The Queen Mother's love of horse racing was legendary, and an annual visit to Ascot Races was foremost in her social calendar. She was National Hunt Racing's most respected owner. This very expensive hobby gave rise to questions about where she got her money from to support her racing habits.
King George VI didn't pay income tax. Somehow the monarchy arranged that they wouldn't pay income tax. So of course this vast fortune that they'd all inherited, and they owned a lot of properties and so on, all this untaxed money simply built up, and of course they had the most wonderful financial advice. So really a great fortune was built up, and she, having always had as much money as she wanted, never learned to economize. She simply spent and spent and spent. She loves clothes, she loves jewelry, she loves luxurious kind of life. She spends money on the races, she's got her own race horses. She's never really wanted for anything, and I think she's always thought, but why should she? All this money is there, I may as well spend it. In the end, she has, I believe, something like a £4 million overdraft.
Queen Mother has an Olympian view about money. It's there, and it's there to be spent, and life is to be lived, and money helps. She doesn't concern herself with money. The Queen lobs her the odd amount of money so often. I mean, she does. I think she rather despairs of the Queen Mother's extravagance. Not another new dress, Mummy. And the Queen Mother would say, well, I have to dress up for them, don't I?
On a trip to Venice in 1984, the Queen Mother found her gondola ride magnifico, magnifico. For her, it was the fulfillment of a long-held ambition to revisit the glorious city and to indulge yet again in one of her favourite pastimes, dressing up.
She loves clothes. She absolutely adores them. She's excited about new clothes still. It doesn't matter if she has 6 blue coats. If there's a new blue coat, she's excited about it, and how wonderful that is.
Her most noticeable trademark, her hats, gradually evolved to become the gracious and unmistakable image of her years as Queen Mother.
She grew up at a time when you did always wear a hat. You wore a hat as a little girl to school, to church. You always wore a hat. You weren't dressed outside your front door without a hat. No matter how ornate, what an amazing confection her hat may be, she will always, even if it has a big brim, it will always be turned up and soft and feminine. I mean, feminine is the key to everything.
Good guess.
The Queen Mother's home was Clarence House, a modest place by royal standards, but was it big enough to store all her clothes?
All her clothes are in polythene bags, beautifully kept, all on rails, sort of in her dressing room, which I think, and gather that they've spilled out all along corridors and everything else. She will not throw anything away.
Her dignified appearance enthralled millions of people for as long as they could remember. The good and the great always turned out to meet the grand old lady. Always elegant and dignified, she knew when to enjoy herself. Off duty, she was a lively companion. At home, she entertained a wide circle of friends.
Clarence House, where the Queen Mother lives just off the Mall, is littered with works of art, modern, impressionist, I think some classic stuff too, sculptures, and it has a wonderful, comfortable clutter too, very much a home. Lots of photographs, lots of mementos, a reflection of 100 years. She loves to entertain, loves to have people with her, loves to eat in the open air, and they set out the table in the garden of Clarence House in what she calls my green rooms, under the trees, and the table is laid with the most wonderful china and glass.
She's always lived in great style, and having reached this advantage, she feels, why shouldn't she live in this great style? So yes, the house is full of servants, it's full of wonderful furniture, it's run on very, very lush lines indeed, and she's simply, this is the kind of life she's used to, and she's not going to change it in any way.
The relationship between the Queen Mother and her grandson Prince Charles was always a strong one. On state occasions, he enjoyed the company of his grandmother. They got on well, and since his childhood, she was the shoulder on which he could lean.
Prince Charles is devoted to his grandmother. He thinks she's an absolutely wonderful woman, and they are very, very close indeed. And he, in a way, has got the same sense of almost majesty. He likes a big staff, he likes a lot of servants about, so he, in a way, has inherited this taste for living a kind of rather regal life, certainly from her.
Prince Charles' choice of bride was closely observed by his grandmother after she had watched the young Lady Diana Spencer grow up on the Sandringham estate. According to royal sources, the Queen Mother and her lifelong friend Lady Fermoy, Diana's grandmother, encouraged the couple to get to know one another. The rest was history. "11 months after their wedding, the 20-year-old Diana gave birth to her first child, Prince William. He was christened at Buckingham Palace. On formal royal occasions, the Queen Mother and Princess Diana made a pretty picture. But behind these images, the experienced Elizabeth did not approve of Diana's unpredictability.
Diana turned out to be quite a different woman from what they thought. They thought she was a kind of county girl who would fit in the royal family very well. But as Diana developed and started behaving in this rather unpredictable kind of fashion, then the Queen Mother turned against her, certainly. That she thought she wasn't really behaving in the kind of right royal way at all. So by the end of Diana's life, they certainly resented her. They hated all this kind of washing of dirty linen in public that both Diana and Charles did. The Queen Mother belongs to a generation who feels the royal family should keep their secret and simply present a kind of united and smiling facade to the public, which neither Diana, or certainly Diana nor Charles, is really prepared to do.
The Queen Mother was a widow for longer than a wife, but she created for herself exactly the kind of life Bertie would have wanted for her. By dedicating herself unselfishly to her duties, her family and friends, she veiled her loneliness. As a major power behind the throne, the Queen Mother was one of the main reasons why Great Britain still has a monarchy.
There will never be another monarch who will have seen such enormous changes both in the country, in society, in the world. She saw the great years of the British monarchy change, possibly not irreversibly, possibly irreversibly and irrevocably, I think.
She really did step back from being a prime mover in royal circles, in policy, in the image of the royal family, once she stopped being the Queen Consort. It was a gracious thing to do, it was a wise thing to do. I mean, the last thing you want is an interfering royal mother-in-law.
The Queen Mother's been unique in that she is a woman who has never put a foot wrong. With the royal family, they're either colourful or they're conscientious, with so many of the members. She's been both. She's been a woman who is a very colourful, very charismatic figure, but has always behaved herself, always been very dignified. So I think she really has achieved something unique in the present royal family.